My name is Reagan Allen, and I am with the Martin G. James Center for Academic Renewal. I am here interviewing Jay Schalin, who is a senior fellow at the Martin Center. He recently wrote a report about DEI in medical schools, which will be released this week. So, my first question is, you argue that DEI policies have seriously undermined meritocracy in medical school admissions. What are some of the most striking examples that you uncovered during your research?
Well, as far I'm kind of thinking like, what are the effects of this? And I know it like UCLA, they have, which is, most of the report was about the top 10. Every year there, or every year, and every website has a different top 10, but the usual suspects appear on most. And UCLA is a common considered a very elite medical school. And in the last few years, there are these things called shelf exams, which they test medical students on like the basic knowledge, like for the most common procedures, like pediatric stuff or emergency room procedures and things like that. And usually, for all medical schools, there's about a 5% failure rate nationwide. And UCLA has been getting failure rates way above the 5%, some as high as 50%, which tells you that they're not either the teaching's bad or the students aren't qualified, one or the other. Um, and I see some things like the University of Penn has a program where minority students can be accepted without taking their MCAT scores, which MCAT scores are crucial. Medicine is a very important. It's very important to have extremely intelligent people. There are some professions where you don't want to monkey around with the meritocracy, like airline pilots and doctors. We do not want to have less than the best at those things, and the MCAT scores do a good job of showing, okay, who has the intellectual chops to be a top doctor. And the University of Penn, another one of the top medical schools, um, they have a program where if a minority student goes to this summer program, they don't have to submit MCAT scores. So we don't know what we're getting there. And it could be that they are, in fact, admitting very unqualified students who do not have the sheer brain power to do things like analyze immense amounts of data to come up with some kind of diagnosis that might be totally original. This requires a lot of brains, and so that's something that's going on. And this is not new. Um, this sort of thing has been going on since the about 1965. I believe it was the Civil Rights Act, and there was the back then we used to call it affirmative action, and there was the big lawsuit in 1978, and you had it was Alan Backey, was a white student, highly qualified, was turned down at the University of California at Davis, and he filed a lawsuit, and eventually there was this really bad compromise decision, which kind of said, well, you can't decide on race, but can use race as a consideration for admissions, which doesn't really solve anything. Back into school, have a very good geologist at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. There was this other student, and he was kind of the poster boy for uh, um, affirmative action, and he was lauded by the New York Times and Ted Kennedy, who was a senator at the time. And they said, he was kind of like the person that they loved as this is the person who was accepted instead of Baki originally. And in 1997, he had his license revoked for just terrible things like patients were dying on him. He opened a liposuction clinic, and a patient died on him. And he apparently was recorded humiliating patients who were in pain. And it was just okay. No, it was a clear cut example of no, we should stick with the best applicants at all. So that's kind of those are some of the things that DEI or affirmative action produces, these bad results.
And from your research, are these problems limited to the elite universities or is it more widespread?
Not at all. It's very widespread. One example that I wrote about was at the University of Southern Illinois Medical School, and a statistic I have in the the class accepted for 2024, of 24 Black and Hispanic students who were admitted, 17 had lower scores than the average white or Asian student who was rejected. So you can tell that there's a really big uh, difference of who's being admitted here. It's not just a very narrow thing. Um, like in that year, Hispanic students had an average MCAT score of 503.5, which is just slightly above average. Um, Asian students had one of uh, 513, which was the 85th percentile. So it's not just like okay, it's this very narrow deciding qualification. No, you've got really big differences. And one of the problems I think here is that in the non-elite schools, who are the bottom? Are they really qualified to be doctors? At the elite schools, their bottom admitted students still probably could be doctors. They probably shouldn't be going to the most difficult medical school, but they could be going to lesser medical schools and do quite well and fully qualified to be doctors. But I question whether somebody who is being admitted on due to DEI at some of these less prestigious really should be trained to be doctors. So yeah, it's everywhere. It's all throughout academia in every nook and cranny.
That is a scary thought. And many defenders of DEI argue that these programs are necessary to produce doctors who are more culturally competent and better equipped to serve diverse communities. How do you respond to that argument?
There is a slight gain. There are now. This is I'm not a doctor, so I can't give you like the really good specifics. But
Mhm.
let's just say, like sickle cell anemia is it's pretty much restricted to people of West African ancestry. So there are some genetic and cultural things that might actually help a bit, but the gains coming from that are so small compared to the gains that you would get from having a much more qualified applicant. It's much more the gains you're going to get are much, much bigger from having the most qualified people. And furthermore, today, doctors are smart. They can do research. There's a vast amount of literature discussing like things like the difference with sickle cell anemia and many other such problems that only affect certain people. So they can do literature reviews. There's AI that will help with that. So you've got, you know, all kinds of tools that to help you get past that.
Absolutely. And your report includes recommendations for state legislators and university trustees. Which of those do you believe would have the most immediate impact, and how should policymakers prioritize them?
Okay, I would say the most important is you have to do the enforcement. There's this thing called the soft power, hard power problem. With soft Hard power is when somebody makes a rule or a law and says, you must do this. Soft power is when you have people in a bureaucracy or some sort of organization who actually carry out the rules. And they might say, I don't like this rule, I'm not doing it. And unless there's some sort of serious attempt to enforce these rules, um, an organization may just forget about them. And this has been a very common thing in academia. The board can make all the rules they want, but the faculty and administration might not just might not carry them out. And so that would be the most crucial thing. Another one that I think would be or the way I want to get the most impact is that involve the the faculty, because the faculty influence many doctors downstream. You know, you focus on an admitted student. Well, that's one doctor, but you focus on the faculty, and that one faculty member influences many doctors through the course of his career by teaching them. And so there's some things with faculty hiring that have just been terrible. Um, a lot of them have been forced to make DEI statements. Like professing that I've been involved in DEI or I helped this group or something. And no, it should be, here are my medical qualifications. This is what medical qualifications are, what we should be hiring faculty on, not, this real fuzzy kind of feel good stuff. And another thing is the job advertisements. Very often, they will be narrowly crafted to eliminate uh, white or Asians applicants, or applicants who may not have been involved in any sort of DEI stuff in the past. And so, you have to eliminate that sort of thing. Um, and of course, and what has been happening in many of the red states is there's just a blanket, hey, eliminate all the DEI stuff. And I know that in North Carolina, there's something like that going on. And there, in at least 30 states, there's some kind of legislation or board action pending. So we are seeing that, but certainly that's the best. On the other hand, I question whether you're going to get all you need from like single bullet, the silver bullet that kills everything, kind of reforms. I think what we have to do is it's been very successful for the left, but to keep pushing the envelope in many different directions and taking whatever you can get. And just keep that steady pressure on, keep pushing. And in that way, you can dismantle. You may not be able to get everything all at once, but you can dismantle things over time.
Do you think it would be a positive thing to wipe all DEI policies? Do you think there would be any drawbacks or negatives to that? You kind of touched on that, but
Not really. I think that I think that, I mean, we are talking about something that's much bigger than medical schools. We're talking about there is this massive civilizational change that is occurring. For over a century, the West has been moving in the direction of egalitarianism. That's the equity part of DEI. In other words, we're trying to equalize everything. And that's been going on and on and on. And it is embedded in all the institutions, not just the universities, but all the bureaucracies and uh, everything. And we're now at the point where it's kind of started changing, and the other side, the meritocracy side, is starting to make some gains. That used to be the rule in the West, but that's been pushed out. I would say that the 2023 court decisions, students for fair housing, fair housing, for fair admissions, that was against UNC and Harvard. That is kind of the thing that has resolved the issue in favor of meritocracy.
Mhm.
And I think this is a good thing. Once again, we do not want our the people who design our buildings to be poorly qualified. We don't want our doctors to be poorly qualified. We don't want our airline pilots to be uh, poorly qualified. We want the best in whatever we can get, and it's time to start pushing back in that direction. So no, I don't see any reason to continue DEI at all.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my next question, which is you describe what appears to be widespread defiance of the Supreme Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. What should be done to ensure compliance with race-neutral admissions policies?
Just to give an example of some of the defiance, or a few examples of the defiance, Kaiser Permanente and the University of Chicago medical schools, after the Students for Fair Admissions Act demanded, okay, no, you have to go to meritocracy now, they actually admitted Mormon. I mean, the predictions were there were going to be a lot fewer Black and Hispanic students and a lot more whites and Asians. And they went in the opposite direction. It was basically just a, no, we're not doing it. We're doing what we want kind of thing. At UCLA, which seems to be a real, they seem to be extremely defiant. They have in California, there was Proposition 209, I think in 1996, which basically outlawed all discrimination in state activities, including UCLA's medical school, completely ignored. Then there was the Students for Fair Housing in 2023, uh, and they were doing things like there was one white male student who was turned down. His MCAT scores were 526, which are the highest score you can get. And he had excellent grades from an outstanding university. How do you turn this guy down for people with MCAT scores 20 points lower, getting close to, decent, but not, not UCLA medical school level? So they were thumbing their nose. And then in 2025, just this year, President Trump sent around a couple of executive orders. I forget the one, but the other one was it prevented accrediting agencies from mandating DEI policies. And, couple of months after that, UCLA sent out some memo telling people, okay, or we have to put pro DEI people on our admissions and hiring committees. Just completely, no, we're not doing it. So this sort of defiance, it's widespread. One thing that we're seeing is all kinds of stuff. Like it was maddening because I picked up this report halfway through, and so a lot of the research had disappeared because of those executive orders. Um, and so yeah, they're kind of taking things off the websites, but sometimes you can find them in another place in the website, and it's you get the feeling that they're doing what they have to do to avoid any sanctions by the Trump administration, but they're still not really complying, or they're avoiding as much compliance as they can. Um, so there are some things that can be done. Um, I think there are some levers. Government is a big one. Um, Now, you have certain, everything depends on the particulars. The best situation are public universities or public medical schools in red states because they have legislatures that appoint boards who will go be against DEI. They will put in sensible reforms. Then you have some problematic things. You have some public uh, medical schools in blue states. Well, the politicians are going to be the same politicians that put these board people who put DEI policies in place in the first place. So you're not going to see too much improvement coming from the state government there, or and it's private schools can be very problematic because they tend to have their boards that are self-replicating. The board chooses its followers, and so they just stay in the same path. Now, the federal government has some levers. There are executive orders: do this, or you don't get your funding, and your federal funding, and that's a great, that's an important lever. I know that Harvard kind of feels it has so much money that they don't have to worry about that somewhat, but a lot of schools will feel the pinch there. Um, there's also lawsuits. Uh, Students for fair admissions was a, it's making a difference, and we're seeing there is the lawsuit going against UCLA for the same thing. Um, it may finally wrangle UCLA into some sort of compliance. So there are some promising things going. There are some things that can be done. Um, and if you start getting better faculty, or better faculty, you start getting better, uh, or you just start having government policies and different policies, and you start pushing, things might improve. We might also see, okay, the results coming out of the red state publics where they are reforming, they might be better. And so there might, they might have better results because of their better policies. Well, that may have an effect down the road a bit. Like, people are saying, "Wow, I'll hire the guy from UNC over the guy from Harvard because UNC is not a DEI school." And so you could have some things like that happening on there. There could be improvements. I Right now it's the Wild West sort of, but we have to be hopeful.
And have you seen the negative impacts of these DEI policies in the medical field after school, as far as unqualified doctors making mistakes in their field?
I didn't go into that much, but like I said, there was the Alan Backey and Benjamin Chavez example, in which the guy was just completely unqualified and even had a little nasty streak in him. And yeah, I mean, I was coming across comments like this one professor, I think it was at UCLA again, says, "I have students who know nothing." Um, and that's what happens when you don't start using the MCAT scores as your primary way of deciding who to admit. You just you can if There are two other things that are important. One is the grades, and the other is personal experience, along with the MCAT scores. And the personal experience, that's very fuzzy kind of thing. The grades are okay, but we all know that um, you go to some, uh, the valedictorian at some small rural high school is going to struggle to keep up with the A minus students at some prestigious, high powered suburban school or some elite private school. I'm talking undergrads or I'm talking high school students, and it's the same in college. The best students at the top schools are going to be performing at a much high, and even the better than average students at the top schools are going to be performing generally at a higher average or a higher level than the best students at lower end schools. It's just, you know, talent matters, and talent especially matters in the medical field.
Hmm. And given the deeply entrenched nature of DEI in higher education, what gives you the hope that reform is still possible? And what role do watchdogs like the Martin Center play in that effort?
Well, information matters. You know, if if medical schools are able to just go about their business without any kind of oversight or watchdogs, and it's a like a blue state where they're all very intent on advancing the egalitarian mission. They've rejected the meritocracy as much as possible. And that is the truth in many of our bluer states. Um, they can just function like they always have and just keep getting worse and worse and more DEI. So, one of the things that the Martin Center does is it provides that information. The other things organizations like the Martin Center do is they contact people who are in positions to do something or at least try to do something. We are in contact with many legislators and board members all across the country. And we give them the information that they need to know to make smart decisions. So that is one of the things the Martin Center does very well. And there are other organizations. I have to throw out a shout out to the Do No Harm organization, which they focus on digging out the dirt about medical schools. They're that's their sole focus, and so they do a great job. I relied on them quite a bit, and so yeah, there is this. Like I said, it's a two-sided coin. I think it's going to be hard as heck to move a lot of schools. However, there are going to be a lot of schools which are going to go along with this, and we are going to see a reversion to the much more to the meritocracy. And I think that's good for the medical field. It's good for academia. It's good for America.
Hmm. You think there'd be no room for politics in the medical field, that it would just be a straightforward business?
Yeah, well, we had this little thing called COVID, so
That was
there's
a crazy year.
yeah, so yes, no, unfortunately, politics slithers into every nook and cranny of our existence, and medical field's no exception. But we just have to put constraints on it.
Mhm, absolutely. And that was my last question. Is there anything else you would like to add about your report?
Get on the Martin Center. That's or www.jamesgmartin.center, I believe. And yeah, take a look at it. Try not to be shocked because there's some bad stuff in there, and stay informed.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the work you do and your time for this interview. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Reagan.